Sunday, we saw this passage from the Gospel of John, and with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit." And the question emerges, how do we relate this with the teaching in Acts chapter 2 that the Holy Spirit came down in power on the disciples at Pentecost many weeks after the events of Easter Sunday, which is when this passage in John's Gospel takes place. And in this video, we'll be looking at some of the different ways people have sought to explain it. Some authors would explain the difference between John and Acts by simply saying that what we have in the Gospel of John is John's version of Pentecost, that in John's Gospel, the gift of the Holy Spirit to the disciples comes on Easter Sunday as Jesus breathes on them. People who take this position tend to say that we have to take each Gospel on its own terms. And whilst I sympathize with that as a general principle, there's also the issue that you cannot be too cavalier about the need that occasionally emerges to reconcile what we read in different Gospels. Also, I would say that this perspective fails on its own terms, because in John's Gospel, Jesus has said that he needs to go to the Father, and when he has returned to the Father, he will send the Holy Spirit to his disciples. And at this moment, he is still there physically among his disciples. They can touch his hands, they can put their hands in the side that has been pierced. So this criteria within John's Gospel for sending the Spirit does not seem to have been fulfilled. A few authors trying to get around this by saying that actually in John's Gospel, Jesus has already ascended to the Father, and it is the ascended Jesus who appears to his disciples. But this is a rather convoluted explanation, and arguably, if we can find something simpler, that should be preferred. Another way of explaining this passage, and in this case reconciling it with Acts chapter 2, is to state that Jesus gave the Holy Spirit to the disciples in two stages. That what we have here on Easter Sunday is Jesus imparting the presence of the Holy Spirit among them, but that actually they would have to remain in Jerusalem and receive power on high, the power of the Holy Spirit, to be his witnesses at Pentecost. And this has the advantage that it both takes seriously Jesus' statement, receive the Holy Spirit, and at the same time seeks to reconcile it with Pentecost. It's perhaps not so easy to understand how we can neatly disassociate the idea of the presence of the Holy Spirit from the Holy Spirit being present in power. And also, it has the same limitation as the previous perspective, that actually Jesus has yet to ascend to the Father, which is what he said needed to happen before the disciples would receive the Holy Spirit. These limitations lead to my preference for what I presented on Sunday, that actually when Jesus is among his disciples and says, receive the Holy Spirit, this is a symbolic gesture. It is Jesus repeating the promise of the Holy Spirit that he had already made the disciples before the cross. For the disciples who were nervous and anxious about what their role might be in the coming kingdom, now that Jesus is raised from the dead, he repeats the promise that they will receive the Holy Spirit. I believe that this explanation, whilst yes, it does require us to take Jesus' words in a symbolic way, which is actually quite common in John's Gospel anyway, both takes John's Gospel seriously on its own terms, allows us to understand how this relates to the day of Pentecost, of which one is would expect the author of John's Gospel to be aware and understands also how it is still going to be the ascended Jesus who returns to the Father, who will give the Holy Spirit to his disciples. One way of explaining the relationship between Jesus, the Holy Spirit, and his disciples is that whilst Jesus is on earth, the Holy Spirit is present with the disciples through Jesus. When Jesus is with the Father, he is present with all his disciples, including us, through the Holy Spirit.